Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're tearing into an ancient text that is just an absolute masterclass in narrative structure and stark contrast. We are looking closely at the second chapter of the Gospel of John, and I've got to say, I am so excited to guide you through this. It is literally packed with drama, super subtle details, and these massive thematic shifts. So we're going to decode this text together and visually break down exactly how this piece of historical narrative unfolds. I mean, talk about some serious narrative whiplash, right? How on earth do we go from the ultimate community celebration, a joyous wedding feast, to a chaotic, highly physical, whip-cracking protest in just a matter of days? The author is intentionally placing these two extreme events right next to each other to tell us something profound. So let's take a look at how this incredible pivot actually gets set up.
All right, part one, a wedding in Cana, the private sign.
So the text drops us right on the third day at a marriage in Cana of Galilee. Jesus, his mother, and his disciples are all on the guest list. And right away, we're introduced to this quiet, very domestic crisis. The mother of Jesus just turns to him and says, "They have no wine." Now, running out of wine at a wedding in this culture, that would be a massive social embarrassment. But look at this incredibly cryptic reply from Jesus. "Woman, what have I to do with thee? Mine hour is not yet come." Despite this being a pretty standard household problem, his response is loaded with deep, heavy foreshadowing. He's already pointing toward a much larger timeline, his mysterious hour. Even so, his mother just turns to the servants and tells them, "Whatsoever he saith unto you, do it."
Okay, let's really dive into this, because the author does something brilliant here. To ground this highly spiritual story in absolute, concrete, physical reality. The text specifically notes that there were exactly 6 stone water pots sitting right there. It doesn't just vaguely say some pots, it gives us the hard data.
And these weren't just your standard kitchen pots either. The text actually gives us their specific function and their volume. Their original purpose was for the purifying of the Jews, meaning they were there for strict ceremonial religious washing. And their capacity? 2 or 3 firkins apiece. Just to put that into perspective for a second, that is roughly 20 to 30 gallons each. We're talking up to 180 gallons of liquid. These were absolutely massive, incredibly heavy stone containers. The text really wants us to grasp the sheer scale and the solemn religious context of the objects being used for what's going to happen next. Moving right along to part 2, the first miracle, water to wine.
You know what's really wild about this? It's the mechanics of it. There are no dramatic incantations here, no flashing lights. Jesus just issues a super direct 3-step sequence. First, he tells the servants, fill the water pots with water. And the text makes sure to note they filled them right up to the absolute brim. Second, he says, draw out now. And third, bear unto the governor of the feast. That's it. The servants simply follow these practical, totally physical steps. The actual profound transformation happens quietly, somewhere between drawing it out and handing it to the governor. And here's where we get this perfect moment of dramatic irony. The governor of the feast tastes it, completely oblivious to where it actually came from, though the author gives us a little aside, noting, "But the servants which drew the water knew." So the governor calls the bridegroom over and delivers what's basically the narrative punchline. He says, "Look, usually people serve the good wine first and the cheap stuff later when people have had plenty to drink. But thou hast kept the good wine until now." So this miracle, it isn't just about sheer quantity, it's about unparalleled quality. So, the aftermath of this incredibly quiet, almost behind-the-scenes event is summed up beautifully here. The text calls it this beginning of miracles in Cana. It says it manifested forth his glory, and his disciples believed on him. It was a totally private revelation, seemingly meant just to solidify the belief of his absolute closest followers. From here, the text notes they took a quick transitional trip down to Capernaum, but they only stayed there for not many days. Why? Because the story is about to aggressively pivot. All right, brace yourself for part 3, cleansing the temple, the public disruption. Because we are about to see a massive shift in tone. When Jesus arrives down in Jerusalem for Passover, the atmosphere he encounters at the temple is just overwhelmingly commercial. Picture this, the deafening noise, the smell of livestock, oxen, sheep, doves, and you got the changers of money just sitting there doing business. What was supposed to be a sacred, holy space had essentially been transformed into a bustling, noisy, highly transactional marketplace. It's the absolute epicenter of their religion, completely overtaken by commerce. And his reaction? It is literally explosive. Jesus physically makes a weapon out of small cords. He drives every single one of them out of the temple, along with the sheep and the oxen. He pours out the changers' money, and he physically overthrows their tables. I mean, think about the stark contrast here. Just a few days ago, he was quietly fixing a social faux pas at a wedding to keep a party going. Now, he's initiating a chaotic, aggressive, entirely physical disruption in the single most important building in the nation. And to the guy selling doves, he drops this central, absolutely blazing command: "Take these things hence, make not my Father's house an house of merchandise." He is stepping up and claiming direct, authoritative ownership of that space. The text actually notes that as his disciples watched this intense, crazy scene unfold, they remembered an ancient scripture: "The zeal of thine house hath eaten me up."
Which leads us perfectly into part 4, the temple of the body, the prophetic metaphor.
Look, you don't just upend the national epicenter of religion without someone asking a few questions, right? The Jewish leaders immediately step in and demand an explanation. They ask him, "What sign showest thou unto us, seeing that thou doest these things?" And Jesus answers them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." Now, the Jewish leaders are completely bewildered. They're looking around at the literal stone building, and they're like, 40 and 6 years was this temple and building, and wilt thou rear it up in 3 days? But the text clarifies the deep misunderstanding for us. But he spake of the temple of his body. This is a direct, brilliant collision between the literal, physical interpretation by the crowds and the profound prophetic metaphor spoken by Jesus. Now, from a storytelling perspective, this is a massive call forward. The text explicitly tells us that even his own disciples did not fully grasp what he meant at the time. It was only much later, when therefore he was risen from the dead, that his disciples actually remembered he said this, and that's when they fully believed the scripture and his word. The author is literally setting up the ultimate conclusion of this entire historical narrative right here in chapter 2. Let's bring it all home with part 5, the nature of belief, the aftermath.
If we map out the chronological timeline of events during this Passover feast, it's pretty fascinating. On day 3, we had that quiet, private belief generated among the disciples at the Cana wedding. Then a quick transition period in Capernaum. And now at Passover, we see widespread public belief in Jerusalem. The text says many believed in his name when they saw the miracles which he did. So the scale has completely shifted from a few guys at a wedding to massive crowds, from a private sign to a totally public spectacle.
But here is the absolute kicker. Despite this sudden, massive wave of public belief, the text gives us this stark, internal, psychological caveat. It says, "But Jesus did not commit himself unto them, because he knew all men, and needed not that any should testify of man, for he knew what was in man." He completely saw through the crowd's sudden enthusiasm. He recognized that their belief was entirely superficial. It was based purely on being wowed by the spectacle of the miracles, rather than actually understanding the deep, metaphorical truth of who he was. So, what is the ultimate takeaway here? By intentionally placing the quiet, behind-the-scenes miracle of the wine right next to this explosive, highly public disruption of the temple, and then ending on a stern warning about human nature, what is this ancient text trying to tell us? It really forces us to ask, what is the true difference between simply being amazed by a spectacle and actually achieving deep-rooted understanding? Honestly, it's a question about the human condition that hits just as hard today as it did thousands of years ago. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope it leaves you eager to dive back into these incredible historical narratives and start decoding even more for yourself.